Math 13 students, you out there? I think you are somewhere. All right, so today I'm going to go ahead and give you an introduction to Chapter 8. It is the ultimate section in some sense of our text. It's really why we develop all the material up to this point. From Chapter 8 on, we really just use the techniques we developed in Chapter 8 to answer various different types of questions. So, at the end of the day, we conduct what we call a hypothesis test. Basically, we test a claim about a population parameter. This would be something like a population proportion, or perhaps a population mean, or maybe something else. At the end of the day, there are two competing claims that are addressed. Both cannot be true at the same time. This is very, very similar to what happens in a criminal court case. In fact, that really provides a very good analogy for what it is we're about to do. And I do like the analogy because people have a lot of experience, TV shows and the like, with the process that unfolds in a criminal court case. So let me jump over to my other screen. I'll draw a picture or two to try to convey the detail, and then we'll take a look at what's going to happen in the chapter itself. All right, so as you may know, most court cases begin with this notion of innocent until proven guilty. It's actually not quite true. Really, we begin with the notion of not guilty, and then evidence is provided, either for or against the defendant. And I'm going to use a number line analogy because it works very, very well here. We start with the notion of not guilty. And then at that point, the prosecution offers up evidence that refutes the notion of not guilty. If that evidence piles up high enough, the notion of not guilty is hard for the jury to sustain, and the jury will return a guilty verdict. It's very, very similar when we work with a hypothesis test in statistics. Here in the hypothesis test, we actually use a distribution. We have something called the null hypothesis, which is equivalent to the not guilty. And evidence is collected via samples, and we'll use the central limit theorem. And if my sample statistic falls far enough from the notion of not guilty, if you will, this is where we return the notion of guilty, or what passes for guilty when we conduct a test of hypothesis. Now let me jump back to the other camera, and I'll go over some of the detail. All right, at the end of the day, Chapter 8 is set up a little bit differently than Chapter 7. 8.1, your very first section, introduces all the various elements, tools, and processes you need for the entire chapter. Some we use a lot, some we use not so much, and some not at all, quite frankly, here in Chapter 8. We wait a little bit before we get into some of this. It's also complicated by the fact that there are two very basic methods of approaching a hypothesis test. They are entirely equivalent. One is a bit more visual than the other. So I like to start with the more visual method. We usually use what we call the p-value method to address a test of hypothesis, and that follows from the very, very visual method. So I'll start with the visual method, then I'll quickly segue, if you will, into the p-value approach or method. Also, in addition to that little bit of detail, there's a number of other pieces of information, such as how we like to state our hypotheses, how we like to state outcomes, the various types of error that one encounters when one conducts a test of hypothesis. So we'll get into all of that in 8.1. Then we'll get into some of the specifics as we go through the balance of the chapter. In particular, 8.2, we test claims about a population proportion. We use that p hat equals x over n to test claims about p, the population proportion. So we try to use a small sample, and we extrapolate from that to a larger population. We'll do the same in section 8.3. We'll use a sample mean to try to test claims about a population mean. So we'll get into all the detail of how we do that. 8.1 is where all the nuts and bolts are laid out. They don't really come together though until 8.2 and beyond. However, once they do come together, the recipe is pretty much always the same. By that, I mean the process always has the same general 5 steps, and we really look at the same type of number in every single test. Where that number comes from is really where the detail is. Different types of claims, different types of samples, they require different types of tools. So we'll take a look at all those different types of tools as we go through chapter 8 and beyond. And again, 8.1, it's all about the bits and pieces. Don't expect it to come together until 8.2. All right, I'll post this on the website and we'll get going. Thank you and goodbye.